There's a lot of smoke blown about the first console war between Nintendo and Sega, which was basically just like some edgy ads that Sega put out in the early 90s. In comparison to that, though, there was a legit console fight between Sega and Sony. At E3 1995, both companies tried their hardest to pull whatever stunt would get them the most attention and good press. On Sega's front, that meant releasing their console 6 months early with no games and no advertising. That didn't go well. Sony, however, had two ideas. First, to price their console $100 lower than the Saturn and announce it in the smuggest way possible. $299. And second, to put a sexy Russian lady with a whip in the advertisements. That Russian lady was from Battle Arena Toshinden, the game that this video is about. She's my main, by the way. Our chronology of launch games has jumped forward a month, from the Japanese launch of PlayStation in December of 1994 to January 1st of 1995. Just barely missing the PS1's end-of-year launch, Battle Arena Toshinden was a 3D fighter built with one singular purpose: to kill Virtua Fighter. So, before we get to Toshinden, let's go over the game it was made in response to. Virtua Fighter is the common origin point for all 3D fighting games, and it itself came from Virtua Racing, Sega's first polygonal 3D racer. Virtua Fighter was developed to use the same Model 1 arcade boards that Virtua Racing had run on, but it used 3D graphics to render human characters instead of cars and roads. In 1993, Virtua Fighter shook shit up. The fighting games as a whole were very new, rapidly changing, and massively popular at the time of Virtua Fighter's Japanese arcade release in 1993. When Virtua Fighter introduced 3D graphics and gameplay built to complement them, it was incredibly popular and stood out massively from the sprite-based fighting games it competed with in the arcades. It took just over a year for real competition to come for Virtua Fighter in 3D fighting games, in the form of Tekken in the arcades and Toshinden at home. While Tekken took the traditional route, hitting arcades first and getting console ports later, Toshinden, released barely a month after Tekken, was a home console game only. Tekken by far had the tougher challenge. The arcades were Sega's home turf, in a sense, and in addition to the 2D fighters that Tekken was up against in the arcades, it was also against the graphically impressive sequel to Virtua Fighter, which had come out in November of 1994. Toshinden, on the other hand, had quite an easy challenge: to be better than a faithful but slightly sloppy port of a game built for primitive 3D hardware that was already 2 years out of date. Just like with Ridge Racer, we've got to talk about what the Saturn was up to if we want to understand the context of Toshinden on PlayStation. And what the Saturn was up to was a mostly competent port of Virtua Fighter. The Saturn's controller was a natural fit for Virtua Fighter's 3-button controls, and the game ran smoothly. But it had a problem in common with Daytona, and with much less justification. Virtua Fighter on Sega Saturn has pop-in. The game culls quads too aggressively, by which I mean at all. The game should not have needed the performance boost on the Saturn's hardware. That, combined with its low resolution, made even the ports to Sega's last-gen 32X hardware add-on look better than this game does, let alone the arcade version. To make this worse, Virtua Fighter isn't an especially ambitious game for the Saturn. The Sega Saturn was a game console built from the ground up for rendering textured 3D models, to the point that it treats its primitives almost more like flexibly scalable sprites than traditional polygons. Virtua Fighter, however, was a port of a game designed for hardware that wasn't capable of 3D texture mapping, and instead it used flat-colored and flat-shaded polygons for its character models. This led to the game being a pretty unimpressive showcase for the Saturn graphically. Before we get further into Toshinden, I'd like to spend a little more time on Virtua Fighter. In terms of gameplay, it really was the game that laid the foundations for 3D fighting as a genre, and I think that Battle Arena Toshinden is best understood in the context of other 3D fighters around it. And to fully understand that context, you need to understand Virtua Fighter. So, what actually sets a 3D fighter apart from the more traditional style of fighter, like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat? Well, Virtua Fighter at least had a few things. First, Virtua Fighter focused on more down-to-earth combat, with a stronger interest in actual martial arts than the Dragon Ball-inspired fantasy martial arts of other popular fighters of the day, like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. Second, it took a lot of inspiration from sumo, Japan's national sport. The specific things Virtua Fighter got from sumo were a ring-out rule and a 30-second match timer. Those two additions led to both an increase in money made for the arcade operators, with shorter matches leading to more quarters per minute of playtime, and to a fighting game with a lot more variety of strategy than its contemporaries. Just as much as someone playing Virtua Fighter wants to control the health bars by blocking, landing, and dodging attacks correctly, they also need to more seriously consider space, how close you and your opponent are to the edge of arena, and whether you can safely execute certain actions without risking a ring out, as well as time, either rushing to make up a health deficit or stalling to win a match without having to pursue a knockout. Basically, Virtua Fighter made the strategy of fighting games a lot more complicated, trading the mechanical input complexity of combos and motion inputs for the strategic complexity of ring-outs and timeouts. And the 3D fighting competition of 1995 largely left those things behind. Tekken ditched both the timeouts and ring-outs, instead opting for long combos to make the more down-to-earth fighting interesting. And Toshinden left behind the timeouts and realistic fighting that made Virtua Fighter feel like real sport fighting, to return to the older style of fantastical fighting game characters with big personalities and special moves. So, with all that context covered, let's get back to the start of this video. Battle Arena Toshinden was a 3D fighter with the singular goal of beating the Saturn port of Virtua Fighter. How did it do? First off, Toshinden is a nice, simple fighter. It's got basically all the most appealing elements of each fighting series at the time. It has 4 button controls from games like Fatal Fury and King of Fighters, which aren't too different from the 5 button controls of Mortal Kombat. It has the motion input special moves of Street Fighter, and it has the 3D graphics and ring-out system of Virtua Fighter. It also has a Dark Souls dodge roll. I'm not even really joking when I say that. It's easy to overlook the impact of fighting games on broader gaming, especially as someone more into adventure games and platformers myself, but 3D fighters were legitimately innovative, just as much as Super Mario 64 would define the camera and movement systems of many modern games. 3D fighters have a pretty clear line of inspiration in gameplay to influential action-adventure games like The Legend of Zelda and Dark Souls. The style of call-response 3D combat that's the default for a lot of modern games was laid out first in these early 3D fighters, and that includes Toshinden's dodge buttons. The dodge rolls in Toshinden don't necessarily give the same system as you'd find in Dark Souls. Instead, they add a lot of depth to the ring-out system that it borrows from Virtua Fighter. In fact, the dodge roll in this game adds so much depth that Sega themselves took notice and would later go on to copy the mechanic from Toshinden outright in Virtua Fighter 3 and Sonic the Fighters. A similar dodge roll system would also later be implemented into the Fatal Fury games, which initially featured a background dodge mechanic that likely inspired Toshinden in the first place. The actual characters in Toshinden are all really fun. Being a weapon-based fighting game makes it really easy to have lots of character variety without needing to resort to more extreme and zany characters, like Street Fighter's stretchy Dalsim or animalistic Blanca. Everybody in the core roster is just a normal person with special attacks and a different weapon, even if multiple of those unique weapons are just different takes on sword fighters. Because this game is the first in its series, it had to sell itself to players who knew nothing about it. All the character designs are pretty intuitive and self-explanatory because of that. Russian whip lady, crazy old man, shonen protagonist, cooler shonen protagonist, things like that. Outside of being 3D and focusing on characters with weapons instead of hand-to-hand martial arts, Toshinden is mostly a standard fighting game of the era. What set it apart from Tekken and Virtua Fighter was that it went back to the more traditional style of fighting game, like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. Toshinden has 4 kinds of attack: light weapon, heavy weapon, light kick, and heavy kick. The kicks almost switch roles compared to the typical fighter. Instead of being slower, longer range, and harder hitting than punches, they're instead faster, shorter range, and less impactful than weapon attacks. All attacks also have high, low, and air variants, depending on if your fighter is standing, crouching, or jumping. Alongside its attacks, Toshinden also has a Street Fighter-esque movement-based blocking system, where moving away from your opponent automatically blocks, reducing incoming damage from enemy attacks by a large amount. This blocking system is your only way to reduce incoming damage. There is no accompanying counter system like in Street Fighter. Also, like Street Fighter, Toshinden has motion inputs that let the player perform special moves. All the characters have 2 easy-to-perform moves, 1 more complicated move, and then 2 hidden moves, which are taught to the player after they beat boss fights in the single player. One of these is a desperation move, a more powerful than normal attack that can be used only while at low health. The other is a fiendishly difficult but super powerful combo that is more so present for party tricks and bragging rights than actual gameplay utility. Toshinden has a pretty standard set of modes for the time. It has an arcade mode where you fight the whole roster, and then a secret boss character with a second secret boss if you beat it all on hard without losing once. And it has a versus mode that you can either play against another person or the computer. The bosses are both alright. Gaia is a bit boring. He mostly just spams his special moves. He's not as fun of a fight as the rest of the roster, in my opinion. And the secret final boss, Sho, is just an edgier version of Eiji, the game's protagonist slash mascot. Those are the same thing in a fighting game. This is really disappointing since Eiji already has a clone character in the roster. But this guy's basically bonus content, and especially in the 90s, it was pretty common for secret characters in fighting games to be simple variations on the existing roster, so it's not bad, just a little disappointing. Overall, Toshinden is a solid game. It offers a lot in single player, and it's a lot of fun in multiplayer. It's got a lot of its own unique identity, and more than met the challenge of the Saturn's Virtua Fighter port. Toshinden wasn't much to write home about in comparison to the rest of the second wave of 3D fighters that came to arcades while it was coming to consoles, and even many contemporary 2D fighters in arcades outclassed it in terms of gameplay. But it was a standout at the PlayStation's launch. And on a personal note, its familiar mechanics, charming characters, and the forgiving nature of the dodge roll mechanic got me into 3D fighters in a way that I wasn't before I started this project. For the launch of the PlayStation, Toshinden was able to be a graphical showcase for the console, and even position PlayStation as a viable alternative to gaming in arcades, with its own exclusive experiences. The other big boon Toshinden brought to PS1 was solid multiplayer. A fighting game's big draw, both in arcades and at home, was playing it with other people. Unlike Ridge Racer and a lot of the PlayStation's launch lineup to come, and frankly the PlayStation library in general, Toshinden was a game more than one person could play, and that mattered for ensuring the console would have real variety on launch. Next up, the first game for Sony's new console published by Sony's music division. Kiliak, the DNA Imperative, brings first-person shooting to the PlayStation.